Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much. It's very smart here.
It is. It's an old school.
I thought it was an insurance building.
No, I think it was an old school.
Blimey.
People say Hogwarts, but I've never seen... I was going to say Game of Thrones. It's not Game of Thrones. It is Harry Potter. Harry Potter. So apparently it's like Harry Potter.
Is it?
Yeah.
I'll take your word for it.
Where we usually start is a little bit about you, what you're doing at the moment, where you came from. I know you've got an interesting past, so just set the scene there and we'll take the conversation from there.
It's like one of those funerals you go to, don't you? And after half an hour they go, and then he went to primary school.
We might not have that long, but
exactly.
yeah.
So what are the points that got me here? So I spend my lifetime talking to people about human difference and why we bother to talk about human difference. And I suppose that starting point is because, we can't understand the world in the way other people understand it, and we can't see it in the way other people see it or experience it in the way other people see it. So what do? We try, but we can only bother to try if we know we're not going to succeed, because that's what makes the journey exciting. So anybody who's ever been in a relationship will know that's what you do. Mm-hmm. You spend all your time. Sometimes you look in the morning and you will look at your partner and think, I've no idea who you are. And other days you look at your partner and think, I know exactly who you are. So I kind of start from that, really, is that's the great discovery, right? So once you realise that, then that's about curiosity. So you're curious about the world. And I've always been lucky to be curious about the world, mainly, I think, because I was brilliantly taught. And, I read quite a lot as a kid. So that all happened. And then I went to Sussex University, which is, in those days was as right on as you get, really. It sort of still is in some ways, but differently so. And then came out, and that then put me into another place, because that was kind of interesting. That was it's like another kind of difference, if you like. And the thing about being gay, if you're a white middle class, or upper middle class bloke, you're not that outside the game. But if you're gay, you're a little bit outside the game. I'm not claiming anything special about it. It's just kind of an objective kind of where you are. So you're always slightly outside the way in which things are played, typically. And that's quite an interesting place to be. So when you're 20% of me's observing, 80% of me's in the game kind of thing. And that led me towards, inevitably campaigning. I'm very old. I came out in 1977, but that was only 10 years after it was illegal to be gay in Britain. And I forget how close I was to history, if you like. So then Sussex was a good place, Brighton, it's all very kind of fab. And we used to go and stick I'm gay badges on the rugby club and, all that sort of stuff. And then, and we, you occupied the refectory to bring an end to apartheid, and all that, which worked, by the way. So we're pleased about that. But anyway, so all that happened. And then the 80s happened. And it was a very peculiar era to be gay in some ways, because it was full of extraordinary energy. There was an unleashing of energy in lots of ways. So entrepreneurial energies at pubs, clubs, all that stuff was going on. But at the same time, the first person to die of AIDS in the UK died in 81. And then by the end of a kind of almost a decade of stigma, the government decided to do this thing called Section 28, which never really got prosecuted or implemented, but it was using us as a tool to beat what in those days, remember, they were called the loony left press, or the loony left boroughs, rather, and the red tops and the tabloids really went for this, they're promoting gay, you've got to be gay and harrying gay, all this kind of stuff. What was interesting about that was that we took a surprisingly tactically, strategically clever approach to it. I don't think we thought it through in any kind of step one, step two, step three kind of way. But instead of making it about being gay, we made it about freedom of speech. We made it about the kind of equality issue rather than anything else. And what's interesting about that is that all the advances in lesbian and gay equality have always been achieved in this country by not asking people to take a view about homosexuality. Because if you say to people in 1989, do you think gay relationships are a good thing? We were 80-20 down. Mm-hmm. So it was a stupid way to begin a campaign. But if you say to people, do you think a group of people should be demonised or discriminated against by the law or socially as a group? Well, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, they understand what you mean by that. So they go, no, that's a bad idea. So you say, well, will you come and fight for equality? So to some extent, they were prepared to do that. So I learned something really important through the foundation of Stonewall, which is this idea of the bigger issue, the bigger principle, if you like. And the point about that is that really fed into what I do now. Because the thing about diversity and inclusion, DEI, as they anachronize it these days, is that it's about that fundamental idea of difference. And that's difference of opinion, it's different views, it's different lifestyles, it's different backgrounds, different identities. And it's based on that idea of valuing that difference. And it's then, how do you combine with other people with whom you're different, and by the way, with whom you don't necessarily agree about a whole bunch of stuff around what you've got to do at work. So those are the steps that led me to this idea that you're in an organisation. What's valuable is to try and work out what's the different contribution that you, Neil, bring and I, Simon, bring, and how do we combine that in pursuit of whatever it is, in this case, the podcast. And so that means you don't impose rules, you don't impose language. Yes, of course, you have guidelines or guardrails about how you do and don't talk to each other or do and don't behave towards each other, but most of that's not malicious when that goes clumsy. Most of it's accidental. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we do have rules. That's fair enough. You say, well, actually, we by and large, white people are not supposed to treat black people in a racist way. That's a pretty good rule. Men shouldn't treat women in a sexist way. That's a pretty good rule. One of the difficulties is when somebody experiences something as sexism or racism, but it wasn't meant as that.
Yeah.
And that's the bit where it becomes difficult. Or at least clumsy and interesting, actually. Yeah, not difficult, interesting. So those are the steps that got me here. And I mean, they've gone through, I trained as a lawyer, and then I became a stand-up comedian for 10 years, and then I became a journalist and a broadcaster for however many years, and now I'm doing this. So I can't really keep down a job.
So this is it?
This is it. God knows what I'll be doing. I'm almost 70.
Are you?
You'll have to shout very loud.
You look well for 70.
I'm standing by the bus stop going, I'm 67,
So the whole DEI or DE and I know you're not a fan of the acronyms. It's a term which is discussed and bandied around a lot. We hear it in our industry with recruiters where they say it's really important, it's the next big trend, candidates need to get on board with it, clients even more so need to get on board with it. Some people roll their eyes, some people don't really know what to do with it, how to do it. So what would, for those people who are listening and they think, okay, well, I don't really know where to start, I know perhaps I need to think about it or embrace it or implement it, but I don't know how, why, successes, considerations, where do people start?
I think a good place is to think about your team. So if you think about the team you work in and you're watching or listening, close your eyes and just think around the people in your team and think who you rely on and what for. And the second thing is think, well, we've got to do whatever it is, make pizzas or fly people to the moon or whatever it is you do. Now, you've got an idea of who contributes what to that joint effort. Next thought is, who do I wish was around the team? Because actually, when that happens, we don't know enough about that or we don't understand this. And then the other thing, which is even more difficult, is what you don't know. And that's the moment where you need to think about what you're trying to do, and then you need to think really hard about what kind of combination of people do you need to do it. So an example, what do we value when we recruit people? So I was talking today to somebody, I was giving an example where we helped recruit the head of research for an East London council. So they didn't want somebody who was a desk-based sort of policy wonk, if you like. They wanted somebody to get out there into the community, and they got particular priority around issues that young black men are experiencing in the borough. So those could be all sorts of things, from mental health through to knife crime, through to gangs, through to unemployment, whatever it is. So they wanted someone who could go out there and form those kind of relationships. So that's already you're describing a person who brings certain skills or certain contacts or certain understanding of certain networks. They might well end up being black, the person that you recruit. But that's not the starting point. The starting point is what you want them to bring through their experience. So somebody white could turn up and say, well, I've worked in Tower Hamlets for 20 years with young black kids. Actually, I've got tons of networks. I'm really up for it. I'm fine. I can get out there. Well, they'd be on the short list. So what I say to people is always try and think about what are people bringing through who they are in order to join with the people you've already got. So you're always adding difference. So I use this thing called the virtuous circle. of selection. So it goes, what are you trying to do? What kind of combination of difference, brackets, aka diversity, do you need to do it? So who have you got? So who do you want to add? But as I said, the difficult bit is what you don't know, Mm-hmm. So what happens then is, in order to put that into effect, you then have to really value what it is you've brought into the team. So there's two parts to it. There's the bit where you say, well, who do we really need? What do we want them to bring? And once you've decided that, if you want them to bring something you haven't got, then you've got to understand that that's going to change the shape of the team. Mm-hmm. If you have people around to supper or dinner or play cards or whatever it is, it's different when there are different people around the table. You have to remember that things change as a result of who's around the table. And the way I always think about that is, I think, well, you've got to see difference, value difference, and then combine it. So you've got to do all three things. So you recruit for difference, you bring it in, and then you support it so that actually it produces the result you want. So if you're a recruiter, that's a slightly different way of thinking about standard capabilities or competencies, for instance. Because each time you recruit, those competencies slightly change. Now, there are threshold competencies. I mean, if you're going to recruit a doctor, they need to be able to be a doctor. You know, if you're going to recruit an architect, the building needs not to fall down, so they need to know what a flying buttress is or wherever it is. There are competencies that are threshold, fine, no trade-off with quality. But beyond that, once you've got that skill level, who do you really want?
And when you say people, the difficulties when people don't know what they don't know, you used an example at a talk that I was at where you said at board level, some people will say, okay, well, we should have men and we should have women. Well, why would you need that? Because growing up in the workplace, men, if they get tasks or activities wrong, tend to get a pat on the back
for giving it a go.
Good luck next time.
Yes.
Women tend to be, you weren't really up for the job. So when they get to board level or senior position, they perceive risk differently. And that was for me a bit of a, right, okay, so I'm now starting to get this. But how do people, when you say they don't know what they don't know, how do they find out about what they should know?
Well, there's two things. I mean, one, that is a really interesting example. It's a bit of research from Harvard Business Review. If you do notes of the podcast, I'll send you the link, put it in. And it's really interesting. So women's jeopardy around risk is much higher if you're not rewarded for taking risk. So when you get to that combination, so the metric the researchers used was, did companies in their growth strategies go for mergers and acquisition, high risk, high return, or did they go for research and development, much lower risk, longer term return? Now, culturally, women and men operate like that. That doesn't mean to say that every man and every woman operates like that. We have personalities as well as those kind of group cultures. But the point is, when they combine, they produce something different. So how do you know? Very interesting experiment done by a lovely researcher who died a few years ago, sadly, but she did this murder mystery. And she gave groups of 3 people, all male, all female, all white, all black, and then mixed male and female, black and white. She gave them murder mystery. Each person in the threesome had the same information, but each person had one bit of information the other 2 didn't have. Solve the murder. So the mixed groups did it 75% of the time and much quicker. The homogenous groups did it only 50% of the time and much slower. And what she realised was that the obvious presence of difference and the acknowledgement of it, see, value, deploy, the knowledge of it sparked people off to thinking about difference. So, for instance, if you're recruiting, say, into a call centre or something. So we did some work with one of the ambulance companies. And they said, well, we want to represent the population we serve. Well, you can't do that. I mean, it's far too diverse. What you can do, though, is have enough difference in the call centre so that you're alert to the idea that different people in your region will contact, access, and want to be treated by the ambulance service differently. So the way you find out what you don't know is to start to value the difference around the room so that you give real free rein to that inquiry and curiosity. You won't always do it because there'll always be unknowns, but you start to be alert to differences outside the room or in the community or in the business or in the sector or amongst your customers or whatever it is. You just start to ask different questions.
Okay. And do you think people who perhaps have a bit of a cynical view or pessimistic view, I'll put my hand up, I was maybe is in that camp until, we started talking. Do you think, for me, it was like, okay, you need to set up a quota. And then I think that it's kind of like, it discriminates against the people who deserve certain roles or recognition through merit or through experience. So how do you kind of like break that barrier so people realise that it's a good thing?
Yeah, people put targets and quotas on, and one is quotas are not legal in this country.
Yeah.
So in order to achieve a quota, you're saying we want 40% women, and therefore we will employ people because they're women because it fills a quota. That's unlawful. So we don't do that. We've got two mechanisms. One is that if you do your data, gather your data, and you discover there is a distinct imbalance, then what you are able to do is to think about the way in which you might change that imbalance. So you're never allowed to recruit people because they're female, black, gay, or whatever, but you can take into account, by instance, putting people on shortlists. But what I always say is there's no value at all in compromising the skill threshold that they need to exceed. Why would you do that? Why would you put someone in a job where they haven't got the skills to do it? So that's absolutely crucial. Okay, so how do they do it? Well, what they do is you set targets in a number of different ways and for a number of different reasons. Famously, that phrase, what gets measured gets done, is thought to have been said by a business guru in America called Drucker. The only thing was he didn't say it. What he actually said was, targets are a way of understanding whether the human relationships you've put together are delivering the outcomes that you want. So the point about targets is not to hit them. The point is, what happens when you don't hit them? What happened when you did hit them, or when you exceeded or didn't exceed? It's the process. So firstly, only use targets as a way of learning what's going on in your case, the recruitment market. Why didn't we get enough women to apply? When they applied, why didn't they get on the shortlist? Actually, so use it constantly. Use that data to understand. Don't punish people for not reaching the target. Use the fact that you didn't reach the target to understand more. Second thing is, when you set targets, set realistic targets. You just got to do the maths. X team, X department, we're going to grow it by this amount. We have this amount of person turnover per year. So over a 5-year period, we've got this number of opportunities. So therefore, what does that tell us about the possibility of a target? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in other words, make them realistic. But the key thing is never recruit people, not just because it's not lawful, but it's kind of demeaning to say to somebody, you've got the job because you're a woman. Why would you do that? Why would you do that to an individual? You need to recognise their talent. So back to that point about what they're bringing through who they are, that's about how you set up the criteria. So as I said before in the East London Council, the criteria against which you were recruiting will help you to draw in the kind of demographic you're looking for. But within that demographic, you want the right person.
So do you think that it's more the communication? So when you do hear companies who say we want to recruit more people from this background or of this gender, I know you're saying it's illegal, but you do get companies who openly talk about it.
But my question to them is why?
Why? Yeah.
What are you trying to achieve? So we're working with 2 of the water companies at the moment. They are regional employers. So their view is, for all sorts of reasons, strategic, PR, whatever, their view is they're major employers in the region. They want to be seen and actually to offer opportunities to the breadth of the population. And if they're looking at it and thinking, well, that's interesting, all our apprentices are white, but all our apprentice age people in the population are not white, what's happening there? We're a regional employer, we're an anchor employer. We want to make sure that we're offering opportunities to people. That would be a good reason to ask the question, why is it not happening? But the reason they want to do it is related to their reputation and position in the community. Perfectly reasonable. They want to do that. On the other hand, if you're not a business that's sort of demographically based, then it's a different question as to why do I... So I'll give you an example. An English literature department that we worked with, and the person who had the department said, we want you to help us add diversity to the staff. And I went, why? Doing fantastic. great research, great students, loads of grants, all going gangbusters. What do you want to do? She said something, she said, very simply stated, there is great English literature being written in the world at the moment by people who are not English. What she wanted Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian novelist. She wanted people from Nigeria or Kenya or the Caribbean, where great literature is being written in English by people who are not English. It would look like ethnic diversity. That's not what she wanted. What she wanted was cultural and geographic diversity, because that spoke to the core objectives of a university department, which is teaching and research. And in her case, the modern state of the English literature canon. It's directly related to the core objective. So that's what I always say to people. When you say we want more black people, CEOs say to me the whole time, we must get more women. And I always say the same thing. I said, let's hop out in the high street then and get 6 assorted, shall we? And they go, I don't mean that. I go, no, you don't mean that. But women are not a job lot, You're going to get 6 women. What a daft thing to say. Why? Why do you want it? And until you can answer that question, the recruiter can't recruit you the women that you need.
And do you think most people know why, or do you think they just don't know how to communicate?
No,
why?
I think a lot of people have not taken the time. Part of the problem with DEI, BAME, LGBTQ, all these acronyms and all this stuff has built up into a kind of peculiar momentum now, where chief execs, they thought, right, do diversity is a very good thing to do. And you hear them say it's the right thing to do. So then they say to HR, you pop off and do the right thing. There we go. I don't mean dismissively, but they go, there you go, off, you go and do it. And HR goes off and does it. And then what happens is that no one at this point has said why we need to do it. They just think it's the right thing to do. But no one says why it's the right thing to do. And crucially, why is it the business strategic right thing to do? So then they go off, and then what happens is it's developed into this thing now where people go, oh, well, and I was having a chat with a company the other day. Oh, we've started our D&I journey. Everybody's, by the way, on a journey. Where you are, you're on a journey, and immediately I think, well, that's fun. Is it an M road? Is it an A road? Is there services?
It's a bit of a business cliche word, isn't it?
That's it. We're all on a journey. It's not those individuals who go on TikTok or whatever. They go, I'm on a journey. You go, do you know what? I really hope it's away from me, because I'm so uninterested in what you're about to tell me. Anyway, they're on a journey, and so what they do is there's this sort of thing that's kind of now started, which is a sort of little, you open the box and there's kind of toolkit apparently. So what you do is you do the calendar of all the religious festivals, then you get the lanyards, then you set up the staff network groups, then you do reverse mentoring, and you do all these things. But no one has actually said at any point during these things, what are these things designed to achieve? Now, I'm not being horrible about people. They'll say things like, well, it's about awareness. Fantastic. Okay, marvellous. You're in a construction company, and it would be great maybe where there are perhaps less gay people, or there's an atmosphere in which gay people don't necessarily come out because it's not like, trendy, arty place, a bit more conservative perhaps. Great. So you wear the lanyard and people feel fantastic. There's a bit of recognition here. This is great. Starts a conversation. But actually to change things, if you really are going to say to yourself, right, actually, we're going to do a bunch of building in Soho or Canal Street in Manchester. So what we want to do is change the culture so that our operatives on the ground, they're going to feel comfortable being in a gay district, and the people who are walking by are not going to get, abused by them at the worst or teased by them at the less bad. That's a culture change. That's actually a culture change, and it requires the company to be saying, we mind about the relationship we have with where we're building. We actually mind about that. That matters to our public relation. It matters to our consumer relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once you start to do it, that's a culture change. Now, that's hard work. Culture change is hard work, But what doesn't achieve it is, I always say, I don't know whether I said it the other day, but I often say, we've done a lot of work in construction last year. And I often start off by saying, look, this is one thing I really want to start off by saying is that this is not a lecture by the gays about what you can't say. I promise you I won't do this. I really won't, I said, what it's about is about how we get on together. You get on together so the buildings don't fall down. Well, it's about how they get on with the communities they're building in so there's no tension. Actually, it's harmonious. It all works,
So I've wrote down the word appeal. How... You mentioned there about it was the water utilities company. They want to get more apprentices in from different backgrounds, which is representative of the demographics in that area. How then, I guess, for those recruiters who are listening, and they're working with their clients, not necessarily that client, but how do they then work with clients, or how do businesses then go around appealing to the people that they want to hire or have representative in the company?
Well, there are sort of signals you can give. So, for instance, paternity, the number of men that take paternity and advertising paternity leave is actually a big signal to women, because it's quite unusual still. So that's an example. We worked in a university once that we were working with the manual and ancillary staff, because the porters and the cleaners actually have very close relationships with the students that are living in halls. So they've actually they play quite a pastoral role, and they can play a real red flag role. You know, kids stuck in a room for a week, the cleaner kind of knows. So we were working with them to really value that in the ancillary workers. And as the conversation went on, we said at one stage, I don't know why we said this. I can't remember why I thought this. But I said it'd be really interesting to know where your employee... Oh, I know where it was, because we were talking about... There's quite a significant black, white or Asian white balance in this city. Deliberately not saying where it is. And actually, that wasn't particularly reflected. So the question was, were they not applying? Were they applying and not getting jobs? Whatever. And it turned out they weren't applying. So that was quite interesting. They had that data. They knew that very few Asian and black people applying to work at the university. So that was interesting. So I said, well, I tell you what, why don't you do a postcode analysis of where the manual ancillary workers come from? And it turned out they mostly came from the better off side of the city, because they had relationships with people who were academics or professionals or whatever in the university. They were the plumbers, the gardeners, the babysitters, all those people, because they had a relationship. So they had a sense that the university might be somewhere where they can work. On the other side, the poorer side of the city, where a lot of the ethnic minority communities were living, didn't see the university in that way at all. So what they did was they went out and they just did open days. Not online, nothing like that. They physically went to places where there were these communities and just said, hi, do you want to work at the university? You know, and so what I'm saying is that there are lots of ways of doing it, but one of the things is to understand what's not happening. Are people not applying, or are they applying not getting the job? All of these will have slightly different solutions. So how you appeal to them is by saying, if you come and work for this company, you'll have a good time. You'll have good career prospects and whatever. That's one sort of thing. I mean, they're myriad. That's the trouble. We worked at Glasgow School of Art, which is just the most... It was before both of the fires, which is terrible. But one of the things there is there's quite a large Asian population in Glasgow. None of their kids really go to the Glasgow School of Art. And that's a cultural thing to do with the expectations generally... Not to stereotype, but generally speaking, there's an expectation amongst Asian parents that is quite professionally oriented. So they don't see the art school, they don't see that as a legitimate career. So the kids are not going. Well, what do you do about that? I mean, clearly if the kids who want to go, they should be able to. But you've got to convince the parents. So if you want to appeal, it's not good just convincing the kids, you've got to go and convince the parents.
So it's being seen in the right places is one place to start.
It's articulating in a way that's meaningful to those people who are not applying. And if you want them to apply, that's one thing. If they're applying and not getting through, that's another thing. So you've really got to analyse the what. What's going on? What's the cause of this particular problem you're trying to solve? And then just think imaginatively.
It's a bit of a spider's web, isn't it, the whole thing? It can be quite complex.
Well, it is, and one of the difficulties with recruitment, I mean, you must know this, but people are just endlessly going, well, you want them yesterday.
Yeah.
And I always think, why? Because you've got this kind of, oh my God thing, and then you think, but hang on, you're going to employ somebody, you might put them on probation for a bit, but then you're going to employ them full time. Well, you got them now. If they're no good at what they do, or they're not good at what they do because they're not skilled, or they're not good at what they do because it's the wrong job, or whatever, why not think more carefully, just for a bit before you get into that, before you take them on? So just pause. You don't need them yesterday. You really don't. I know everybody panics like that, but you actually don't. Broadcasting, which I've worked a lot in, that's a real problem, because actually, to some extent, you do need them yesterday. Because what happens is you pitch and pitch and pitch and pitch and pitch, and then the commissioning editor goes, yep, we want it, and we'll put it out in May. know? So what do? You go back to all the people you've ever worked with before, or you just work with them again because you know you can rely on them. And that's difficult. That is difficult because, the pressures are such that that's the problem. So you've got to think a bit more long term about then how you build up a pipeline of skill and how you make sure you're trying to work with different people so that when the emergency does hit, you've got a much wider pool of people to choose from.
And then what does the internal work look like if you are wanting to be more diverse, more representative? There's obviously work that in our world that consultants can have conversations with their clients, but internally, not necessarily at recruitment companies, but internally, if you're wanting to do that and you've got resistance or skepticism internally, how do you open people's minds up to, like one thing that you said and you've said just before is get rid of the acronymisms. It just feels a little bit like buzzwordy.
I always say, look, everybody's got a voice. Everybody's got a voice in diversity. This idea that there's a group of people who just don't have... the number of times I've heard people say to me, oh, well, yeah, I'm just a heterosexual man, In fact, my accountant said to me the other day, I'm just a boring heterosexual. I said, you know what, Roger? Those are two different things. So don't discount yourself, okay? If you're white and you're listening to Black experience, you might listen differently. If you're a man and women are talking, you might listen differently. If a woman's walking down the street, if a woman says, I'm walking down the street at night, and she says to a man, never walk behind me if I'm on my own. Cross the road and go around. Would you mind? It makes me feel safer. Well, you have to be a woman to hear that. Mm-hmm. You just listen and act. Mm-hmm. You've got a voice. You go, yeah, absolutely, I'll support that. That'd be good. So everybody's got a voice, number one. Number two, yes, there are differentials of experience. There are all sorts of differentials of experience, but be curious about everybody. Because what stops those people feeling enthusiastic about it is they think they're going to be told off, say the wrong thing, and there'll be a lot of finger pointing and wagging. This is hopeless. This doesn't get people to exchange and be curious about what they can each do and each bring. So the first thing I would say to people, you really say to people, we've all got a voice in this discussion. We just need to listen differently to people so we really hear these different experiences. Number one. Number two is that there are a bunch of people who, on one end, who just think this is a load of old bull. Mm-hmm. And that's their view, and they're not going to be shifted. And there's a bunch of them over there, and I don't know what you do about them. I mean, I try sometimes, but sometimes you just don't get there. And there's another bunch of people at this end who are so fanatical about it, they can't see anything other than their own point of view. And they're the ones who say, I always say you never should listen to anybody who begins a sentence as a gay man, because that basically says if you're heterosexual, shut up. No, this is not acceptable. So there's that bunch down there who are the sort of identitarians, and they are completely of the view that only their voice matters and actually everybody else should shut up. And they're the ones who talk about white privilege and structural racism and all that stuff, which just writes off a whole bunch of people. I don't go with either of that lot. My view has always been you build these big alliances of people in the centre, mm-hmm. pulling on all their differences to achieve what you're trying to achieve. One of the dangers, and this seeps in from politics outside, what we used to do was that we build the centre to isolate the extremes. What's been happening recently is the extremes have been trying to isolate the centre. Yeah. So what I think you've got to do is talk about it in a very humane way. And the use of the acronyms, I think, is symbolic of this idea which says diversity is this special subject that I know about and you don't know about, so I'm not going to teach you. I'm going to teach you how to be human and understand that other people are different, which is just so, it's real hand-round homework and it's a status thing. And this is ludicrous. The point about diversity is precisely about all of us. So I think we've got to sort of get it back to plain speaking, that fundamental human condition that we can't understand each other, and the great joy is to try and do so. Mm-hmm. Once you get it back to that, mm-hmm. people start to get curious, and then it's interesting. Now it's hard work. If you're black, or if you're a woman. They say, if you're a woman, you do just experience that kind of drip, drip, drip of sexism in lots of places the whole time. And it's just really annoying. It's like a pile driver, And the number of times we do this insight exercise and, the stories that come back, women are just so bored with being asked about how they dress. They're so bored with being asked how they cope having children and holding a job down. They're just, but it's just endless. So to some extent, when you say to them, what's it like being a woman? Sometimes they'll just tell you to, as my brother-in-law says, go to the Foreign Office. Because they can't be bothered. It's too exhausting. So you have to accept that happens sometimes. But fundamentally, if we're trying to make change, those of us who want to make change have got to accept the responsibility of doing it. So that's one thing you need to do. You need to get people engaged in a joint enterprise. There's a beautiful clip of Shirley Temple, the child film star, dancing on the stairs with Mr. Bojangles, who played the butler in this film. And she was told as a child she was not to hold his hand, and she held his hand. If you ever look at it on YouTube, it's the cutest thing of this little white child dancing with this big black guy. And you just think, well, that's the way to deal with racism, isn't it? So I'm kind of, down that line. So that's one thing. The other thing is that you need to change the process of recruitment. So what we did was we developed a process called Recruiting for Difference. It's based on the work of this person called Iris Bonet. She's the doyenne of kind of discriminatory research, if you like, or research and discrimination. She works at Harvard Kennedy. The point that she makes is that the way in which we end up recruiting people is not because we've got personal prejudices in a kind of hostile way. We've got a series of assumptions that we make about certain tasks, about certain jobs, about the person who was in it before, the industry we're in, the pipeline. We've got all these things amount to a series of assumptions that often means we go on appointing the same people. What she says, therefore, is we need to change the process that we use in order to give ourselves a better chance of making better decisions. So what we've done is we've changed the process, and in 3 specific ways it debiases or helps to debias. You can't completely do it, but helps to debias recruitment. So what I would say to people is, if you say you're just recruiting, always recruiting men because you're basically a sexist pig, that doesn't really open up the discussion. It might well be that they've got attitudes that actually don't value the contribution that women can make, or they overvalue the contribution men can make to a job. Fine, they may well have that bias, but just telling them they're biased doesn't help much. But if you give them a different process where they're asked to think differently about how they assess the answers that candidates give and so on, which is what this process does, actually you end up making a better decision, and it builds an evidence based during the process, which makes it easier for people to challenge when at the end of an interview process that people go, well, I just think, and then it goes, they'll fit in better, they'll hit the ground running. Those are all excuses to appoint the person you already want to appoint in the first place. But if you've got the evidence base through the process, others can say, hang on a second, I know you like him better, but actually these 3 women are scoring better, and I'm using a real example from last week. So you've got to change process as well.
And you mentioned their assumptions. How do people address their assumptions?
Well, I think by changing process. I mean, I think that there's a lot of literature on how we change our views about people and how we begin to realise those views.
And do you mean, sorry to interrupt, but do you mean to change the process so you strip away chances of assumption coming into it? Right.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely, perfectly put. That's exactly right. You stop, you lessen the chances of your assumptions butting in, and you're trying to make the choice more objective based on the evidence the candidates are giving you, rather than on your preconceptions.
Right.
But one of the difficult things, I mean, I've certainly found the more I work in diversity, the more I'm aware of the assumptions I make about people. So I always make this joke. My husband's Nigerian, and we were standing at the bus stop one day, and I always tell this story. He always tells it against me, I always tell it against myself. So this guy drives past a black guy drives past in a rather, sporty car. And I went, I wonder who he is. And white guy drives past a bit later in a rather sporty car. And I thought, nice car.
Right.
That's to do with the fact that I've spent all my life watching black men on television in smart cars, and they're always drug dealers, footballers, So you internalise this stuff. We know this. And the thing that's weird about working in diversity is the more you do it, the more you become conscious of stuff, the more it starts to spring out of your mind. It's really quite scary. So I've got tons and tons and tons of stuff. We all have. So instead of beating yourself up about that, you have to take responsibility for it, and you have to find ways of making better decisions and not judging people. So part of it's about saying it's worthwhile challenging myself and finding out what this person's really about. So that's part of what you need to do. But it's hard. And the literature about how and why you change your view of other people is very much about the more you are in equal collaborations with them, the more you actually start to change imperceptibly. You don't realise. There's a very famous Heineken ad, which so they got pairs of people and they'd interviewed each one of them before, and it was typically like a bloke who said, feminism's a load of old rubbish, and a woman who said, I'm a real feminist. But they don't know this about each other. So the man and the woman into a warehouse, there's a flat pack. There are instructions with the flat pack, and what they end up doing is building a bar together. And then obviously, do you want to stay for a drink? Because it's a Heineken ad. And they go, okay. And they then show them the pre-recorded interview in which he says, I think feminism's a load of old junk. And she says, I'm a real feminist. Do you want to stay and talk? And one of the things about the ad, it's a real ad. There's a thing called the human library where the idea is that each person is a book. So you take it and you read it out. The point about these things is that when you put people into those kind of collaborative situations, when we're in that, we do change. We really change because we find the humanity in each other, and we stop thinking of things as abstracts, and we get curious. And the key thing is you don't need to agree. You just need to be able to collaborate. So you don't need to change your view. You just need to be prepared to work with somebody, notwithstanding your differences. Mm-hmm. And then you begin to find out what you can differently bring. And that's very positive.
Yeah, because it's all well and good putting a process in place, but if the process isn't informing a change in behaviour or assumptions, it's just an exercise to get to the end. It's an exercise to get to the end. And I go back to that thing before, see difference, value it, and deploy it. Difference doesn't mean you all have to agree about everything. No. That's a big thing, because most people do. Maybe I thought that. Maybe I thought you have to come to an agreement, but you don't have to. You just need an understanding. I mean, there's a great project called the Forgiveness Project. If you ever had a really terrible day, look at forgivenessproject.com. I mean, the sheer depth of the human experience there is extraordinary. So I have interviewed a number of times Joe Berry, whose father was murdered in the Brighton bomb, and Patrick McGee, who planted the bomb and murdered her father. They have a conversation. It's a long story, not for now. But the point is that Joe went to Belfast and Northern Ireland and said, I want to understand why my father died. And she talked to those people. When the Good Friday Agreement came and Patrick McGee was released as a political prisoner, she said, I want to meet him. She did. They have a conversation. I have moderated it 3 times in my life. I know Joe. I know Patrick now, a little. You can't agree about a murder. No. But you kind of find a way of listening to each other to understand what happens. And it's a really interesting conversation because Patrick never apologises. What he does do is take responsibility for what he did. And he will say, listening to Joe and looking at Joe, that is the most difficult thing I've ever had to do in my life because I realise the pain I've caused her. And he said to her, in the third one, he said something like, I now realise what an amazing man her father must have been because he was her father. Mm. These are big things, but he will still defend it as a military action. Now, I find that kind of both offensive and admirable because if he just got, sorry. Yeah, right. That's a bit wet, but he's accepting responsibility for what he did. Now, you can take, set aside the IRA bit. The point is here are 2 people who, by definition, are not going to agree, but they found a way of being together, talking together, collaborating together. And they work together on sort of peace initiatives. That's what you do at work. I mean, I have a particular view about women's right to choose an abortion. I've worked with many people who are Catholics who have a very different view. So, don't come up. Does it need to come up? We can respect each other's different views and still crack on with each other, So you have to think about how you mesh with people without demanding total agreement. And that's part of the problem that DEI has got itself into, is demanding total agreement. Right back to the beginning, walking down the street in 1989 saying, do you approve of gay relationships? Well, no. Yeah. But nonetheless, will you come with me on the equality route under the law? Yes. So where do people start with that then, if they do want to work on their differences and collaborate? Is it, I mean, I know you used that example there from the Brighton bomb, which is a good example, but probably not one which people are going to come across.
Not every day,
no,
is it, where
it's
your
not.
dad's murdered?
No,
No.
it's not. So
Look, it's about purpose. We're talking about work and recruitment here. We're not talking about the bit. This translates, I think, into the outside world. But at work, organisations have a purpose. And what's peculiar is the way this purpose has started to be distorted. Because people come into organisations and then they start to say things, I want to bring my whole self to work. God forbid. You're not in the pub. Do you know what I mean? I mean, really? You want to bring your whole self? No, I don't want to bring my whole self to work. There's lots of me I don't want to bring to work. There's a discipline about collaborating with other people in pursuit of a common objective. The company must take a position on X, Y, and Z. Well, why? You know, work has a discipline. So the first thing I'd say to chief execs and HR directors and others in leadership is define that purpose. Be really clear about why we are all here together. And in so doing, we then say, what are we trying to do together and what do we each bring to that central purpose? That's the key dynamic at work. It's not about whether you agree about Ukraine or Me Too or whatever. Yes, there are issues within work that enable you to work well together. So if you're black, you do not work well if you're in a place where there's people being racist. Mm-hmm. So that's a reason not to be racist, quite apart from the moral value of not being racist. That's fundamentally, I mean, why should we not be racist? Because we ought to value people for the content of their character rather than the colour of their skin, to quote the well-known quote. So that helps us to work together. So yes, of course, the moral value helps us to work together. But fundamentally at work, we're at work. Mm-hmm. So that sentence, bring my whole self to work, people put the emphasis on the word self. I put the emphasis on the word work. Mm-hmm. Bring my whole self to work. What do I bring through my journey? Back to the researcher in the East London borough. What am I bringing through my understanding of working in East London with black kids? What am I bringing through my story that's going to help me understand and do that? Mm-hmm. So what I would say to leaders is be absolutely clear about the purpose. Lead. Don't do this semi-democratic thing. Right? I mean, consultation's not democracy. You're not asking everybody what you think we should do. What you're saying is, I'm the leader, that's the direction of travel. Now, what I want to know from you is what can you contribute to that direction of travel? And that's about bringing your difference. But it's not about bringing your politics or your political opinions. You know, it's only about that when it's actually your ability to work together. And you see it in all these debates around race when, you know, there is an assumption behind a lot of DEI work that the difference between black people and white people is always a question of race. Well, it's not. There's tons of data to show us that it's not. That when you are in a situation where there are people who are saying gender identity is absolutely fundamental to who I am, fine. There are other people who are saying I'm gender critical, as it's called, or a feminist or whatever. Sex is the fundamental division between male and female. I don't believe in gender identity. Well, there's no reason why those two groups of people shouldn't work well together. Because there's every reason why each of those groups should not demand that the other one thinks the way they do. They've just got to be able to collaborate.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I'm just thinking about some work when I've had opinions different to other people. And
how's it worked out?
I tend to be open-minded. I give an opinion, I would like to think quite tactfully. But then some people do take offence to it somewhat. It can't be just a civil conversation.
Well, and I think it depends where you have it. I mean, what's happening at the moment is, particularly around the gender issue, gender and sex issue, particularly around Israel and Palestine, a lot of CEOs are saying to me, these conversations are happening and they are in and of themselves divisive. So the question is, should we be having them on the formal platforms at work, on the intranet, on email, group email, company email? Really? I mean, actually, is that helping the organisation to do what it should be doing and it wants to do? And I've seen recently some really clever, not clever, wise ways of dealing with this. There was one where there was a massive row on the intranet, this company intranet, about the sex versus gender identity debate. And the exec sponsor wrote and said, look, you know, as a company, we're socially responsible. We understand that people care passionately about this. But is this the right place to have that discussion? Yes, we'll have it by the coffee machine. But is the formal work intranet, is that serving our ability to do what it is we're trying to do? We don't think so. Plus, it's not being done in language and temper that it should be. So increasingly, I think companies are thinking, hang on, actually, let's be clear about what we do and don't want to do. And that's tough, but that's a question of leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, when Nike supported Colin Kaepernick, who took the knee, well, of course they did. I mean, Nike's whole history, its origin is in Michael Jordan. You know, that's absolutely what they would do. But we've had this funny thing.
They're successfully being controversial. Even if they make a few things up.
They did, but you see, they did a funny thing. They did Colin Kaepernick and taking the knee, and obviously Black Lives Matter. But then they did that weird thing when they got a trans influencer or whatever you call this person to advertise their women's sport bra. Mm-hmm. And it was an absolute disaster because it's just not down their lane. It was just silly. They were trying to look a bit trendy.
Yeah, okay.
Well, no, stop with that.
Yeah.
You know, I've just worked with an architecture firm and they made the decision, we did an ethical framework with them, it's a fascinating bit of work, and they made a decision, the only area they're going to make any statements about is the built environment. Because that is absolutely core to what they're doing. Anything else, it was interesting, we didn't construct a policy position, we constructed a mechanism to deal with difficult questions. Should we go and work on the NEOM project in Saudi? So instead of saying, yes, we will never work in Saudi, or yes, we will always work in Saudi, didn't do that at all. They constructed a mechanism. Mm-hmm. And they said, we will set up a working group of staff and directors. We will ask them not to advise us on the decision, but to advise us on the argument. Both sides of the argument, and then we, the board, will take responsibility for making the decision. It's fascinating. But look, I think the key thing about this is that at all points you have to analyse what problem are you trying to solve and why. This underlies everything. You know, whether it's recruitment, are you appealing to the right kind of people that you want to appeal to, or whether it's the application process, are they dropping off during it? When you get into the teams, are we really valuing what people are bringing to the team or the business or the department? At all points, you've got to know why you're trying to do that. So purpose is absolutely all, I think, in this.
So when there is a difference of opinion in the workplace, because you're saying that it's important to collaborate, but always have the why at the end of it so people have clarity on that. But when there is a difference of opinion and it's actually affecting the delivery of the work, how do people go about addressing it so that it's not?
I think there's a difference between a difference of opinion. I'm pro-Brexit, you're not you're pro-Remain. Opinion. I think that's one of those things we say, well, in which case, don't talk about it. You know, that's one thing. But I think what when it becomes difficult is when you've got somebody, a co-chair of a black staff group said to me the other day, she said, I work with somebody, and she was very tactful. She said, who has a different view of race than I do. She's black. And she was obviously saying she thought he was probably a bit racist. But what was different was about how she felt he treated her. And she said she never felt he treated her differently. So I think there is a difference between I don't like what their views are, what their beliefs are, from are they actually behaving in a way that is discriminatory? Because if they are, then that's a process.
That's a problem,
and you collect evidence and you go down it. So that's one set of circumstances. The other one is when you've got, say, the classic at the moment is you've got the man who's transitioned to being a woman and wants to be treated as such. And then you've got the gender critical feminist who says, well, I don't believe you can change sex. And what's difficult about this is that I think the social interactions there are actually a matter of personal negotiation, in my view. I have friends who've made that transition and who, two particular people I'm thinking of, who I've known for years and years and years. I would always refer to them as she. I just do. I mean, it's just the way I make what used to it, and I just do, and it doesn't cause me any problem. There are people who think that's a bit of a thin end of the wedge, that once you start, I don't. I mean, I think it's fine. But what do you do in that situation? Well, here's the difficulty. What happens typically is people go, oh, the trans woman's feelings are then actually, in effect, may not be an intent, but in effect are prioritised over the woman's feelings. But actually, what the case law tells us now is that both of those beliefs, the gender critical belief, in other words, in the immutability of sex, and the gender identity belief, they are both so-called protected beliefs under the Equality Act. Mm-hmm. So the employer is not able to privilege one over the other. Mm-hmm. Because if they do so, and that amounts to harassment or victimisation or discrimination, they'll end up in a tribunal. So the first thing to do is to recognise that when offence is taken, or somebody says, I'm offended or whatever, you have to explore that. Because they don't get to define what is offensive behaviour. That has to be explored and decided on. That doesn't stop them feeling vulnerable, upset, angry, or hurt. I accept that. So what I would say to people is there's a two-stage process here. The first thing is that when you've got these differences of opinion and you're the manager, you go to one person, you say, tell me. And you listen, but you listen to hear, not listen to respond. Just hear, just listen. And then you go to the other one, just listen. Then you can think, okay, now I understand what they're feeling. What do I want out of what I'm going to do next? Have I made a decision that actually on an objective level that was offensive behaviour or language? Well, that's a different thing from saying, actually, they didn't mean it. They said I didn't. That's not a get out of jail free card, but they actually didn't mean it. So how do I now create a dialogue so that we get a positive result out of it? And that's really hard. It's just not easy. So, if you're thinking I can just give you, what you do is you turn to page 13 of the textbook and you do this and this and this. We're human beings, So what you have to try and do is create dialogue around an agreed solution. And it may be that you say, well, look, you don't, maybe you won't work together. Sometimes what happens is they'll go through a process, they go through mediation, and people say, well, I'm still not satisfied. And then you're at a dead end. You either say, well, all right, best let's separate you, put you in different places, or maybe one of you decides to leave, and then often what happens is one of them can decide to leave, and then they take a case out against the company. I mean, these things are messy, so I can't give you an answer that's 100% foolproof. But what I can suggest is that when managers do that, they've got to listen to hear, not respond, and then they've got to try and find a way that they've got to decide what they want out of it. And if what it is disciplinary, then that's one conclusion. But if they want dialogue out of it, then it's worth exploring what happened and then see if we can say, okay, you two, how can we kind of get you? I mean, there is an example of it's not quite on point, but almost. So there was a recruitment process that we were involved in, and there were 4 shortlisted people, 3 external, 1 internal. One of the external got the job. The internal candidate, a British Asian woman, complained that the process was racist. So the person was, which is why it's not quite on point, but it's interesting. So the person who managed, the person who ran the process, and the person who was the internal candidate, same person, he did that. He listened to respond, listened to hear, listened to hear. And then he said to both of them, we don't want a process that excludes anybody because we want access to the best talent. So will you both help me audit our process so that we can really assure ourselves that it doesn't exclude people? And she then felt that her concerns were being tackled. And interestingly, she slightly softened her view. And actually, they did look at the process and whatever. It's quite interesting. Whenever I'll give that setup as a thing to work on tables when I'm doing a session. And HR people often say, it's quite interesting this, they go, well, we'd go and explain to her why the process is
Wasn't.
not this, that, and
Yeah.
the other. And you go, well, I think you'll find that horse has bolted, love. That's what she thinks. It's no good going and telling her that's not what she thinks, because that's what she thinks. So just listen to it. Because people want to be heard. That's a fundamental way of resolving it. And the answer is they're not always resolvable.
Yeah.
But you have to give equal weight. It's like when there's I remember when I wrote my book. I've got a book actually. Oh yes, I've got a book called The Power of Difference. Very, very
You can't
reasonable.
plug that.
Very reasonably priced, I think you'll find.
Is it on Amazon by any chance?
As it happens, it is.
This
The
is.
Power of Difference by Simon Fanshawe.
Okay.
Anyway, there was do you remember Kevin Spacey, the actor? He was artistic director of the Old Vic. There was a series of allegations. They brought somebody in to investigate them. It was a very complicated process because none of the allegations had come to the board. This person investigated, eventually found some people who made the allegations in person. They then went and talked to him and said, what's your view? And what the solicitor said to me was, she said, look, in those situations, you've got to adhere to principle. You cannot assume that accusation is enough. And one of the problems we've got into at the moment is that often pointing the finger, the accusation defines the crime, finds the person guilty and metes out the sentence all in one paragraph. Whereas actually you can't do that. You've really got to give space to both sides of this upset, and then you make some judgments. Now, objectively, you might say, well, objectively, there's a case to answer. In that case, that's what they said. So he resigned. So you've got to somehow work out what you want out of it. Tough.
It is. So with the current movement around diversity with DE and I, where do you think people are getting it wrong, if at all?
They are getting it wrong, and they're getting it wrong because it's now become, in too many cases, not in all cases, a series of rules and prohibitions. You may not say this. You must say that. There is an ideological view which has become dominant in relation to certain subjects. So what you're finding is the difference between black and white people is all about race. All men are behaving in this way towards women. The trans, if you believe in the primacy of sex, you are anti-trans. These are all ideological views. They're single views. And if you want to hold them, hold them. But what companies can't do is impose a single view. And it typically comes out of staff groups that get dominated by gatekeepers of a particular view. And so the fundamental problem is, instead of going to the core of what diversity and inclusion is about, which is you bring a difference, you bring a difference, I bring a difference. The question is, what's that difference? How can we combine it? What's happening is they say diversity is about minorities. So if you're male, shut up. If you're heterosexual, shut up. If you're white, shut up, and so on and so forth. They don't actually say this, but it's the effect of what they say. And so people are getting more and more nervous. They don't know what to say, and they separate into three groups. The ideologues who really are pushing that view, a group of people who are really digging their heels in against that view, and a bunch of people in the middle going, could everybody shut up, please? And that's where it's going wrong. It's not engaging people in this fundamental idea that we've all got a difference to contribute.
Is there ever a case where DE and I shouldn't be considered?
Only when it's done badly. That's when you shouldn't do it. It's always worth valuing the difference that people bring to a joint enterprise, which is what I think lies at the heart of this. What people do, though, is they assume that DEI means a particular thing. So if you're in Cornwall, for instance, so the NHS has this metric, which is the number of people from ethnic minorities on your board should be the same or greater than either that in the population or that in your staff. In Cornwall, there are really very, very few people from ethnic minorities who live in Cornwall. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that, but it's an odd rule because actually there might be other kinds of diversity which are more important in that context. We've just worked in the east of England. If you look at the census, the number of black people defined by the census category who live in King's Lynn, you can count on the fingers of two hands. There are 8. 3% of that population, however, has East European heritage. Mm-hmm. So my point would be, it's always worth asking the question about, A, are we offering opportunities to get the broadest range of talent? And secondly, when they come to us, are they getting the jobs if they've got the skills? But are we doing it for a purpose which genuinely draws on people's difference to achieve what we're trying to do? So it's always worth asking the question, should we do it? But don't answer it by saying, let's get more women, let's get more gays. Right. I mean, do I care whether there are gays on the board of the housing association that I chair? I don't know that I mind that much.
I think we've covered like a lot of good ground there, so thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. If people want to find out more about what you've got to offer or about your book, where would they start? How can they get in touch?
First thing is Diversity by Design is our consultancy, and we specialise in plain speaking, human, outcome-focused work on combining difference. And the second thing is I wrote a book. So if anybody's interested in the research behind what I've talked about, most of it's in the book, and the book is called The Power of Difference, and it's very reasonably priced.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much for coming on.
Pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So thank you.